He revolutionized the instrument, inspired millions of aspiring musicians, and fundamentally altered the DNA of rock and roll. Yet, behind Eddie Van Halen's famously infectious, gap-toothed grin and his mind-bending, frenetic solos lay a complex web of rivalries, insecurities, and resentments that very few people ever truly understood. For a man who appeared to be having the time of his life on stage, wielding his red, white, and black-striped Frankenstrip like a magic wand, the reality of his interpersonal relationships within the guitar community was often fraught with tension. There were 6 specific guitarists whom Eddie admired, fiercely competed against, and at various points in his life, simply could not stand. What drove this hidden, bubbling tension between some of the greatest legends of the genre? Why did so many of rock's most celebrated names end up crossing swords with the very man who had redefined their instrument? To understand Eddie Van Halen is to understand that his genius was inextricably linked to his fragility. Join us as we delve deep into the psyche of a prodigy and uncover the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen hated the most. Long before the world had ever heard the screeching, otherworldly sounds of Eruption, long before the screaming crowds packed arenas to see him, a teenage Eddie Van Halen was just a shy, driven kid sitting on the floor of his cramped Pasadena bedroom. In his hands was a cheap, battered guitar, and beside him lay a worn stack of vinyl records by the band Cream. Night after night, in the quiet seclusion of his family home, Eddie would drop the needle on Crossroads, straining to capture every subtle bend, every fiery lick, and every nuanced phrase that escaped from Eric Clapton's revered Les Paul. In those formative years, Eric Clapton was not merely an influence on the young Van Halen. He was the absolute reason Eddie picked up the guitar in the first place. Eddie famously confessed to Guitar World in a moment of profound vulnerability, "Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me." In the beginning, Eddie did not care about fame, wealth, tonal perfection, or even songwriting in the traditional sense. His singular obsession was understanding what made Clapton's playing feel so inexplicably alive. The phrasing, the sustain, the masterful use of silence and pauses between the notes, all of it became the foundational DNA of Eddie's musical consciousness. But as the years progressed, time inevitably changed everything. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had inadvertently done something that even his idol Eric Clapton had never managed to accomplish. He completely reinvented the electric guitar. When Eruption was unleashed upon the world, it sounded as though it had been beamed down from an alien civilization. His innovative two-handed tapping, his squealing pinch harmonics, and his fearless utilization of the Floyd Rose tremolo system to create dive bombs redefined what was physically and sonically possible on the instrument. Almost overnight, this quiet kid from California became the undisputed future of rock music. Fans worshipped the ground he walked on, but the established old guard, the very musicians Eddie had idolized, listened to his innovations with a deep sense of skepticism and, in some cases, outright disdain. In 1980, when Eric Clapton was approached by journalists and asked to share his thoughts on the rising star Eddie Van Halen, his response was devastatingly dismissive. Clapton casually stated, "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." It was a throwaway line, a classic piece of old-school musician snobbery, but to Eddie, it cut like a knife. For Eddie, the rejection was heartbreaking on a deeply personal level. The man who had single-handedly shaped his early style, the man he viewed as a deity, had just publicly reduced his life's work to a mechanical parlor trick. Years later, Eddie painfully admitted, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." Eddie, being the gentle soul he was, never fired back in the press. He never insulted Clapton's playing or lashed out in a public forum. But those close to him knew that he quietly wrestled with a profound disappointment, struggling to reconcile how strange it felt to be so thoroughly rejected by his childhood hero. Part of this ideological clash stemmed from their fundamentally different philosophies regarding the instrument. Clapton's guitar work was entirely built on the concept of restraint, a deeply blues-rooted style where pure tone, space, and vocal-like phrasing told the emotional story of the song. Eddie's approach was the antithesis of this. It was about absolute freedom, utilizing massive amounts of distortion, embracing chaotic feedback, and engaging in fearless, unbridled sonic experimentation. In a very real sense, they represented two completely different eras of music. Clapton was the pure, soulful sound of the 1960s, while Eddie was the chaotic, brilliant sound of the future. Yet, even through the pain of rejection, Eddie's underlying admiration for Clapton never truly faded. In 1995, he humbly admitted, "Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable. I don't care what anybody says. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that." The two men eventually crossed paths backstage in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie, still carrying the torch of a fanboy, was hopeful for a meaningful connection. Clapton was perfectly polite but entirely distant. They discussed amps and guitars, but they never touched on the emotional core of the music. Afterward, a deflated Eddie told a close friend, "He's just a man. I think I love the myth more than the person." That singular moment changed Eddie forever, marking the exact time he stopped viewing his musical idols as infallible gods and started seeing them simply as flawed human beings. By the end of his life, Eddie had made his peace with the slight, stating, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." There are incredibly few things in the world more nerve-wracking for a young, emerging guitarist than coming face-to-face with a lifelong hero, especially when that hero happens to be Ritchie Blackmore. Blackmore was the moody, unpredictable, and fiercely brilliant mastermind behind the legendary riffs of Deep Purple and Rainbow. For a teenage Eddie Van Halen, Ritchie Blackmore wasn't just another famous rock star. He was a dark prophet of tone and aggression. Eddie would spend hours meticulously studying the intricate note choices of Bane and Highway Star, replaying the vinyl until his fingers literally bled. He idolized the clinical precision of Blackmore's scalar solos, the biting, razor-sharp edge of his distortion, and that haunting, theatrical sense of drama that seemed to hang heavy over every single riff. To Eddie's mind, Ritchie was one of the exceedingly few guitarists on earth who could make the instrument sound genuinely menacing and alive. When Van Halen's self-titled debut album exploded onto the global scene in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself thrust into the same rarefied air as the men he had spent his entire youth idolizing. He was no longer just a kid with a heavily modified Stratocaster copy in his bedroom. He was a chart-topping guitarist who was actively rewriting the established rules of rock. But the dream quickly soured when he finally had the opportunity to meet one of his absolute gods. In a candid 1982 interview with guitar player journalist Jasperbrecht, Eddie recalled their first, deeply disappointing encounter. "He just stared at me," Eddie said, a hint of bewilderment still lingering in his voice. "Wouldn't say hi. Nothing. I was crushed. I thought, well, I looked up to this guy my whole life, and he just blew me off." That icy silence hit Eddie much harder than any verbal insult ever could have. Eddie was not an arrogant rock star. He was famously disarmingly open, the kind of guy who would happily sit on a curb and talk about pickup wiring and potentiometer values for hours. He jammed with anyone who asked and laughed easily. What stayed with him about his interaction with Ritchie was the profound chill in the air, the blank, unyielding stare, the total lack of basic human warmth, and the complete absence of musical connection. Years later, Eddie brought the incident up again, proving how deeply it had scarred him. "People like Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Garage. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way." That brilliant phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," perfectly summed up the visceral sting of the rejection. Eddie had just unleashed eruption upon the world, a solo that completely detonated traditional guitar technique and forced every single rock musician on the planet to rethink their approach to the instrument. Yet, his heroes, the men whose posters had plastered the walls of his childhood bedroom, looked at him with something far colder than professional rivalry. They looked at him with outright dismissal. Part of this behavior could certainly be attributed to Blackmore's notoriously difficult personality. Blackmore was famously imperious, even with his own bandmates, and his entire mystique was heavily dependent on maintaining an aura of untouchable distance. When he was finally asked years later what he genuinely thought of Eddie Van Halen's playing, Blackmore's response felt like a masterclass in passive-aggressive backhanded compliments. "He's a fine player, but I think he plays too many notes." Fans and journalists argued for decades over the true meaning behind that line. Was it a thinly veiled admission of jealousy, or simply rigid, old-school British snobbery? In truth, the quote revealed a much deeper, philosophical divide between two entirely different eras of rock guitar. Blackmore's playing style was heavily shaped by classical music theory and strict restraint. Every single bend and vibrato he executed was meticulously deliberate and calculated. Eddie's playing was the absolute polar opposite. It was liquid, explosive, and completely unbound by conventional rules. Where Ritchie sought to craft absolute control over the neck, Eddie embodied pure, chaotic freedom. It was never exactly a blood feud, but rather a bitter generational standoff. Eddie was the undisputed face of a new, Californian movement of innovators who rewired their own amps, built their own guitars from spare parts, and chased tones that had never previously existed. Blackmore represented the dying breath of the disciplined British hard rock purists, his fretwork forever rooted in rigid structure. Still, Eddie, possessing a heart far too big for bitterness, eventually found a way to understand Blackmore's coldness. I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy, or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshipped that guy growing up. Still do. And over the decades, even the icy Ritchie Blackmore managed to thaw just a little, eventually conceding. Eddie Van Halen brought something new. I can't deny that. What he did with the whammy bar, the tapping, it was clever. He found his own voice. In 1978, Van Halen was a brand new thunderstorm rolling across rock's skyline. Raw, electrifying, and absolutely impossible to ignore. The band's explosive debut album had just begun to violently shake the foundations of the corporate rock airwaves. And Eddie Van Halen, barely 23 years old, was still the hungry, wide-eyed kid from Pasadena, desperately trying to prove he belonged among the pantheon of guitar gods. Each night on their grueling club tour, he tore through his solos as if his very life depended on it. But behind the towering walls of amplifiers and the blinding flash of stage lights, something quietly but consistently stung him. The cold, palpable indifference of the established men he'd grown up idolizing, players like the legendary Joe Perry of Aerosmith. Eddie once recounted to Jasper Brecht how that early touring experience felt when confronted with the reality of his heroes. "People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes," he recalled with a noticeable sigh. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No nothing. I'm not that way." Imagine the psychological toll of being the young prodigy on the road, pouring every ounce of your soul into a performance night after night, and when you finally bump into the heroes whose posters hung on your bedroom wall, they don't even acknowledge your existence. There is no respectful nod, no shared smile between musicians.